This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 680 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Oh, hey, thanks for tuning in. Hey, college football fans, the 2022 season is officially underway, and FanDuel and Xfinity have teamed up to give you a chance to put your college football knowledge to the test. Introducing Xfinity Unbeatable Picks, a free-to-play contest centered around college football's biggest games. Here's how it works. You'll be given a list of 10 game props to answer for college football's biggest matchups of Week 4. Simply head to fanduel.com/free/hub and look for the Xfinity Unbeatable Picks game to enter, and submit your answers for each of the 10 questions. If your picks prove to be unbeatable, you'll win a share of $20,000 in cash prizes, courtesy of Xfinity. Xfinity Unbeatable Picks is set to begin on September 24th at noon Eastern, so make sure to head to fanduel.com/free/hub and look for the Xfinity Unbeatable Picks to make your picks today. No purchase necessary. Now let's get to these mailbag questions. The first question this week comes from Twitter. It's from @flanman00. JJ, what are your thoughts on how the ambiguous backfield theory is playing out so far this season? I know it's only 2 weeks, but thus far, it seems as though some of the more probable ambiguous breakout candidates like Edmonds and ETN might not be hits. Thanks. Okay, so I think I need to just quickly remind people what the ambiguous backfield stuff is all about. Because Travis Etienne, for example, wasn't part of an ambiguous backfield entering the season. I started talking about ambiguous backfields years ago on this podcast. And I did so when analyzing running back breakouts. And these running back breakouts were drafted after round 5 or pick 60. Meaning any running back drafted before that was not part of an ambiguous backfield. And any running back drafted after that point who had a teammate in the early rounds or before round 5, also not an ambiguous backfield. Tony Pollard this year, not an ambiguous backfield. Kareem Hunt, not an ambiguous backfield. Chase Edmonds, though, yes, absolutely. He was in an ambiguous backfield. He was by far the highest drafted Dolphins running back, yes, but we didn't feel that confident in him. If we did, he wouldn't have been like a 7th or 8th round pick. That's why I've called those types of backfields ambiguous, because they are. We're not confident in them. And traditionally, there have been ADP trends that we've observed that tell us that drafting those types of players and not team RB2s with stud RB1 teammates, that's the way to go. I think people have made this way more complicated than it actually is. It's actually pretty binary in nature. It's either this middle or late round running back has a teammate being drafted early or he doesn't. And keep in mind, I've also found that team RB2s in the middle rounds who have team RB1s in the dead zone tend to do pretty well too. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the RB5 and he was part of an ambiguous backfield. Antonio Gibson is the RB11. Miles Sanders is the RB12. Those players are doing just fine from the middle rounds, and none of them had teammates going before them. Ambiguous backfield is really just a way of saying you generally don't want to get players who have teammates with locked-in roles in their offense. It's not that they can't exceed expectation. It's that it's historically been very difficult for them to be league-winning players. So this year, A.J. Dillon technically fell into that bucket, though I always talked about how Green Bay just might be a different beast this year. But Kareem Hunt, Melvin Gordon, Alexander Mattison, Jamal Williams, Nyheim Hines, Isaiah Spiller, Rashad White, those players all had early round teammates. Some of those guys went in the middle rounds. Some of them went in the late rounds. Generally speaking, from a trend standpoint, those players tend to not exceed expectation at a league-winning rate very often. Likely because they won't have a huge role without an injury to their stud teammate. They might have some role, which is why it's a different conversation in best ball leagues, but most of them aren't going to become plug-and-play players. And it's so obvious too, right? Like, it makes a ton of sense as to why that would be the case. For what it's worth, I don't really think 2 weeks is going to tell us all that much. I save these types of conclusions for the end of the season. It doesn't do us any good to say whether or not something's working, because we're not drafting anymore. We're just reacting to what's going on a football field. I just wanted to point out what the idea of ambiguous backfield is and was all about. It's laid out in the late round draft guide. I talked about it in detail on episode 641 too. The bottom line is we rarely, and I mean rarely, get multiple high-end running backs like top 10 or top 20 running backs. We rarely get multiple top 10 or top 20 running backs from the same team in a given season. Like very, very rarely. And since we know that early round running backs have a higher probability of finishing higher than middle and late round ones, that alone tells you that these non-ambiguous backfields are generally bad bets. And I'm not talking about the early round guys. I'm talking about the late round ones from those non-ambiguous backfields. But I would listen to episode 641 if this is still confusing. I know that it can be. You're listening to a quick hitting podcast. You're trying to absorb all this information. I get it. But hopefully this explanation helps. This next question is also from Twitter. It's from @morepaint. It says, will the Garrett Wilson hype last? Yes, the hype is probably going to last until he retires. I may have to go on a rant about this because I've seen some weird reactions to last week's Garrett Wilson performance. Wilson played as the Jets' third wide receiver this past week. Elijah Moore played 61 snaps. Corey Davis was at 55. Wilson only at 43. I've seen that used against Garrett Wilson, as if that number is going to be the same all season long. You really think the Jets' 10th overall pick, a guy who produced alongside legitimate studs in college, a wide receiver who ranked in the 97th percentile in my prospect model, you really think Corey Davis is going to hold him off? I mean, maybe that happens. Maybe the Jets coaching staff is just truly irrational. But guys, Garrett Wilson is for real. Like, all he's done is shown us that he's for real. I freaking love Elijah Moore, and I think Moore is insanely talented. After 2 games, that stance hasn't changed. What has changed is that it's now confirmed that Garrett Wilson is a baller. The chance of him being a baller was pretty high, at least higher than most wide receivers entering the league. But it's confirmed now. Like, this isn't Noah Brown playing his 5th NFL season, coming through with 159 yards through the first 2 games of the year. Noah Brown's doing great. I'm super happy for Noah. But Brown is not Garrett Wilson. No one's making that comparison, I get it. But what I'm saying is, when an incredible prospect enters the NFL and then immediately does incredible things, it's very, very likely that he's very, very good at football. He's not Noah Brown doing great things. He's Garrett Wilson doing great things. This isn't to say that we should expect week 2 to happen each week. What I am saying, though, is that we don't always get situations in fantasy football where a player this talented is sitting on waivers. A player who is talented entering the league and has done nothing but confirm that. Wilson was on a ton of waiver wires entering this week. And honestly, clearly you can hear by my voice, I still think that he's not getting enough love. I think when there's a waiver wire ad, people automatically sort of just assume that he can't be that good. That if he's coming off the waiver wire, how good could he possibly be? And because people think that way, Garrett Wilson might honestly be a buy high candidate. Because he's very, very good at football. Again, I still love the hell out of Elijah Moore. I think he's probably a good buy low candidate. Elijah Moore's a stud. 2 games does not change my evaluation. But this is not hype for Garrett Wilson. This just is Garrett Wilson. And the sooner you realize that, the better off you're going to be in fantasy football. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Braden. It says, any thoughts on the Patriots backfield now? Stevenson played a ton, but barely got the ball and no goal line work. Is he a buy? I think Stevenson's an interesting buy, yes. I contemplated calling him out on the 15 transactions episode this week because even though Damian Harris had the better line on Sunday, Stevenson had the peripherals. In week 1, Damian Harris had 9 attempts, Stevenson had 8. And the target totals favored Harris 3-2. Harris played 8 more snaps too. Ty Montgomery saw a lot of snaps in that game, but he's currently on IR. So in week 2 without Montgomery, the question was, would Ramondre Stevenson be used more as a pass catcher? I actually talked about that on this show last week. Against Pittsburgh, Harris out-attempted Stevenson 15-9, and they both saw 2 targets. So you're probably sitting there thinking, well, this is a complete split backfield favoring Damian Harris, but not so fast. Stevenson played 62% of New England snaps in week 2, far more than Damian Harris. And it's because, according to 4for4 Stat Explorer, Stevenson went from playing 0 third down snaps in week 1 to 61% of them in week 2. His route participation shot up too. Week 1, 15%, week 2, 61%. The routes run difference between Harris and Stevenson was 10-5 in week 1 in favor of Harris. In week 2, it favored Stevenson 23-9. Imagine a world where there's more of a negative game script for the New England Patriots. If this usage continues, Stevenson will absolutely see more work than Damian Harris. more valuable work. So yes, if you want to buy him low, I think you definitely can do that. Like I said, I contemplated making him a buy on the 15 transactions episode this week. This next question is from @GunnerStall. It says, what is the panic level with Derrick Henry? I can't imagine game scripts will favor the Titans given their passing game thus far. There's a lot wrong with Tennessee. And we know that Derrick Henry's usage is going to be largely as a 2-down back. We're seeing that already this season with Dontrell Hilliard and Hassan Haskins running routes in that offense. Derrick Henry has 21 routes run through 2 games according to PFF. That ranks 51st in the league at running back. We know this though. We know he's not that much of a pass catcher. The problem is that when we get games like week 2 against the Bills, he's toast. So yes, that's definitely a concern. I don't think he's a screaming buy for that reason. I think he's a hold. I know big games are likely coming, and he may even hit one of those big games this weekend. For that reason, I'd probably at least risk it for week 3, hold on to him, and hope that he can have a big game before I trade him away. But when you combine an early down back with a mediocre passing attack and a bad offensive line, you run into this. So I'd probably hold, but know that things can get a lot worse with a bad game against the Raiders. The next question is from @DGenKyle. It says, Kyle Pitt's rest of season outlook. Is there much optimism going forward, or is the fantasy community overreacting to a 2-week sample size? I think there's a very real chance that he was overdrafted in fantasy this year. But I don't think now is the time to sell or just full-blown panic. His route participation is identical to last year. He's playing about the same percentage of snaps from the slot as he did in 2021. He's playing a little less out wide, but the real difference from last year to this year is that according to PFF, he's pass blocked on 10 snaps already this year. Last year, the number was 15 across the entire season. He's pass blocked on over 14% of his passing snaps played. Last year, that number was just 2.7%. So they're asking him to block a little bit more. But the good news is that his route participation, it's still decently good. I don't think you need to totally panic. But I do think we're going to look back and see Pitts as being overdrafted this year. The last question this week is from @RightBeard. It says, can I drop Darnell Mooney yet? So I get these questions all the time with these underperforming players who you drafted relatively high. And the answer is, dropping them depends on a whole lot of factors. How deep is your bench? How big is your league? Who are you actually dropping him for? Because if you're dropping Darnell Mooney for just some lottery ticket player, I would argue that Darnell Mooney is a better player to have. Because right now he's a lottery ticket player who's proven to be a pretty good fantasy asset in the past. I know that I talked bad on the Bears offense on the 10 Trends episode, and I still stand by all that. So far this year, it's been atrociously bad for fantasy. But week 1 was the monsoon game. Week 2 was a good Packers defense with the Bears playing on the road. Technically, I think that you could easily argue that it's only going to get better. We won't see this low of passing totals. At least that's what I think is logical. So again, who are you adding for Darnell Mooney? Is it Garrett Wilson? Sure. You guys just heard me rant about Garrett Wilson. Of course I would take Wilson over Darnell Mooney. Is it some random tight end streamer or a backup quarterback? In that case, I'd probably rather hold on to Darnell Mooney. It's important to not let the frustration that you have towards a player sort of overshadow the bigger picture. Because bigger picture, Mooney still does have more upside than most players on the waiver wire. We have a 2-week sample. And one of those 2 weeks, the Bears played in a swimming pool. I'm certainly not saying to buy Mooney, but don't let the annoyance of him being a bust at ADP get in the way of the fact that he didn't just completely lose his ability to be a good football player. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Check out lateround.com for everything I'm offering. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend, everyone. Good luck in week 3. I'll talk to you next week.